Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, where our job is to help you build visibility, professional credibility, and connection with your ideal client by putting the human at the centre of innovative marketing, so you can build and strengthen an engaging, enduring relationship with your ideal clients. I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm honoured that you're here with me. If you haven't joined our wonderful marketing transformation community yet, go to innovabiz.co and collect your free gift as well. Do subscribe to the show and also leave a review because it helps others find us. Let's get into today's masterclass on this InnovaBuzz podcast.
The key is to good decision making is to be consciously focused on things, whereas these biases tend to be a little more subliminal, a little more subconscious. And so the answer is, the first step is to be aware that they exist, that we're not getting an objective view of the world. If I'm certainly not going to talk about the specifics of politics, but, if wherever we find ourselves on the political spectrum, one way to think about getting a different view, or maybe even a more balanced view, is to maybe look at a news source that makes you feel uncomfortable, that does not jive with your worldview or your view of the political arena. So, one general thing is to kind of step outside your beliefs and maybe get a little bit uncomfortable.
Welcome back. I hope you've had an awesome week so far. If you haven't yet listened to my recent conversations with Sean Shepherd of GrowthX and Karan Nijawan of Jube, then do go check them out, but only after you've listened to today's conversation, of course. I'm really excited to have on the InnovaBuzz podcast as my guest today, John Howe, who's Professor of Finance and Missouri Bankers Chair at the University of Missouri, Columbia. John has been a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge in the UK and Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and he's taught courses for the banking group UBS in Switzerland. John's research interests include behavioural economics, corporate governance and banking. He's published extensively in the major journals in finance and accounting, and his book, The Foolish Corner, Avoiding Mind Traps in Personal Financial Decisions, deals with behavioural economics, which I think can have applications in all areas of our professional and personal lives. In our discussion today, John talked to me about survivorship bias and confirmation bias, and how such biases can get in the way of objective assessments in our decision-making and in marketing. He brought up the idea of a pre-mortem assessment of ideas to increase the likelihood of our success. And we talked about how to reframe situations and the way we look at them to make better decisions despite our biases. Without further ado, then, let's fly into the hive and get the buzz from John Howe. Hi, I'm your host, Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm really excited to welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast today from Columbia, Missouri in the USA, John Howe, who's a professor of finance at the University of Missouri in Columbia, an award-winning educator and researcher in the broader area of behavioral economics and finance. And he's also author of the book, The Foolish Corner, Avoiding Mind Traps in Personal Financial Decisions. Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, John. It's a real privilege to have you as my guest.
Well, thank you, Jürgen. Thanks for the invitation.
Now, Scott Christensen, who was our guest on episode 279 of the InnovaBuzz podcast, suggested that we have a conversation with you, John. So big hello to Scott.
Will do. Absolutely. I'll see him later this week.
That's great. Now, the book Foolish Corner is based on a saying attributed, I think, to Aristotle, which says that there's a foolish corner in the brain of even the wisest man. And that's a fascinating quote, and I'm really looking forward to exploring that with you some more in the context of economics, but also in the context of broader application in business and in our lives. Because as you point out in the book, human behavior and the principles underlying it apply across all aspects of our business and our lives. And we're certainly seeing that playing out right now in the global pandemic that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. I think these ideas do have wide applications. So I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is, what differentiates behavioral economics from the traditional kind of economics that probably most of us at our age learnt back at school and university? And how did you come to specialize in that?
Well, that's an interesting question. As most of your audience knows, who's taken a basic econ course, very often what I will call conventional economics is either at the lower levels kind of graphical, or it's mathematical at the higher levels. And so basically what economists have done since the late 40s, when Paul Samuelson wrote a very influential book, they've modeled human behavior in mathematical ways. And so to get into even the upper level classes or in graduate school in econ, you had to have calculus or differential equations and so forth. And so there was this high degree of kind of analytical approach to what I will go again call conventional economics. And but in order to make those models work, or to make them tractable, the modelers had to assume that people were rational. And rationality is a little tough to define, but it basically means that people they collect information rationally, they use it rationally, they evaluate it rationally, and that they have a very clear view of what they're doing, of their own motives, and so forth. So that's kind of what I would call conventional economics. And I don't mean to kind of damn it with faint praise. It has taken us fairly far in the sense that what I would call maybe microeconomics 101 would say something like, if you raise the price of a good, most of the time, people will buy less of it. And so you get some very common sense predictions, which for the most part, but not always, are borne out in the real world. But then a number of people became kind of uneasy with this assumption of rationality. And I don't think anybody has to look very hard in their own life to know people that don't behave at all rationally. And, you might say, hey, I have this odd aunt who only buys stocks, that begin with the letter B or something like that. And so there's we don't have to look very far to see behavior out there that looks pretty irrational to us. So some early researchers started looking at the psychology literature, and probably the grandfather of behavioral economics is Daniel Kahneman, who actually won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for in economic sciences, it's called. He's a psychologist, and he, along with his very frequent co-author, Amos Tversky, did a lot of experiments, of kind of surveys, lab experiments, observational kinds of things that showed that people didn't always behave rationally. And I think a lot of people were kind of worried about that assumption of rationality anyway. It seemed a little extreme. So behavioral economics kind of is the intersection between economics and psychology. And then the question is, if economics, or behavioral economics in particular, is to be what we might hope to be a science, economists like to call themselves social scientists, and they emphasize the science part of it, then they need to have models that make predictions about how people behave, how markets behave, how consumers behave, and so forth. And so people began wondering, if we alter this or kind of step away from this assumption of rationality, do we get models that add to our understanding of the world? And basically, I just kind of caught on to this by reading some of this early psychology literature and social psychology literature. And there's a lot there. I mean, a lot of really fascinating things that we can talk about. And it certainly appears. So basically, I was not trained in behavioral economics. To finally answer your question, we know that professors can be pretty long-winded, and I think I've just proven that. I've just kind of evolved to it and started reading about it. And I think the field did have and still does have a lot to offer. And so, I think a lot of the psychological studies are quite fascinating. And I think we're here trying to get a better understanding of the way the world works.
Mm. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I guess human behavior kind of underpins a lot of things, right? It underpins life. The the thing that I'm curious about, and you talked about the mathematical aspects of traditional economics, and then also the prediction part of predicting how people might behave towards economic trends that the analytics are showing. The thing that I'm curious about, and it always fascinates me, particularly here on the news, we have economic specialists quoted saying, this has happened now, and this is what the impact is going to be, and here's my prediction of what that means, and what will happen to either the stock market, or what will happen to unemployment figures, or what will happen to the exchange rates, classical ones that they talk about. And I'm always curious, how much of that is actual prediction going forward, and the facts kind of either fall into place for that prediction or they don't, depending on whether they've predicted correctly or not, or how much is it that people listen to that prediction and say, well, this is how I've got to behave as a result, and that may be completely unconscious.
So there are a lot of nuances in that question, a lot of interesting things. One is there was some work by a guy named Philip Tetlock originally on political forecasts. And he first of all he's done some work on economic forecasting as well. And he found that for the most part, forecasts were not very accurate. And that was true in the political arena, and later research has shown that these forecasts of, say, GDP growth or exchange rates or almost any financial variable are not very accurate. As an aside, he also showed that the more confident a forecaster was, the less accurate his forecasts were. And so the one thing is, is how much predictability is there in the world? And I think the answer, with admittedly my focus on financial markets and prices of financial instruments and so forth, I think there's a lot less predictability than almost anybody will admit to. So and I think part of it too is there are a couple of things going on. The second part of your question, one is if I make a prediction and it doesn't come true, then that doesn't get a lot of publicity. But if I make a prediction and it does come true, even if I'm proverbially throwing darts, like the market's going to go up or down, if it does come true, then I'm going to advertise myself as being a great prognosticator.
Yeah.
And so we get a little bit of a selection bias in these success things. So that's one thing, that we tend to see the successes and maybe ignore the failures. And if I say the market's going to go up and I don't tell you when, I'm going to be right sooner or later. I mean, at some point I'll be able to claim, hey, I was right. I told Jordan that it was going to go up, and it did go up. But the last part of your question is also very interesting. The way I interpret it is, can these kinds of predictions become self-fulfilling prophecies? And I think there is. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like people ought to behave like the Australian dollar is going to go down in value, then they sell it, and it does go down in value, or some kind of simple narrative like that. I do think there's probably some influence like that. I don't think it's very long-lived, but I think there can be short-term impacts of that sort of kind of self-fulfilling nature of things.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the book, The Foolish Corner, then, because I was fascinated reading through it that, there were so many parallels between how you talk about the impact of human behavior on economics with also marketing, and I mean life in general, obviously, but I was coming at it from a marketing point of view, and you've just mentioned the word bias there. So tell us a little bit about that bias and how that plays into our thinking of particular things, because I think that's a really good one to have us understand better how this might apply to other areas outside of economics.
Yes, and I hope I can shed a little light on that today. If I could just take a step back, What behavioral economics, as I said earlier, was um, based in the psychology literature or the social psychology literature, and there are lots of so-called biases. There are several we could talk about, but there are biases, and for almost all of these biases, there's a reasonable narrative about why the human brain evolved to have these biases, and so these are mostly a story about kind of evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, if you will. And so to find them is not particularly surprising. The word bias that you keyed in on tends to have a negative connotation, but in this realm of behavioral economics, it's really meant just to be descriptive. And so the types of biases that we have now, I will say this: you can find if anybody wants to go Google this, you can find a dictionary of biases that probably has 150 or 250 of them, and it's not clear how many of those are distinct and how many of those are real. We might talk about some of the psychology literature maybe not being as reliable as we'd like, but let's go back. There are very definite biases, tendencies in human behavior and the way we think and the way we absorb information that have probably come from our evolution, that have probably led to the survival of the species. But at times, in the modern world, they don't serve us very well. And so, if you don't mind, I might just launch into one that I think has
Yeah, sure.
marketing kinds of. I've tried to think about your audience and a little bit, and so there's a long list of these, but I think one of my favorites is something called survivorship bias. And survivorship bias is kind of crudely summed up by the statement, the winners write history, or at least it has a parallel in history that way. And so survivorship bias means that generally when we look out in the world, we typically, because of the way the news media selects things, for example, and other people, we tend to see the survivors. So, for example, we see Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates as very extreme examples. But they both dropped out of college. They started a company, and the company is worth literally billions, tens of billions of dollars today. What we don't see, so we see them as the survivors.
Mm.
But what we don't see is all the kids. I'm not supposed to call college students kids, but I do. See all the kids that dropped out of school and started a company and never made it. So there's this kind of we're not seeing the whole population, the whole universe of people who started companies. We're seeing the survivors. My favorite, if you will. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the results of that then is, there's a lot of people putting forward the belief at the moment that you don't really need a college education these days. There's so many other opportunities. You can go out and look at Zuckerberg, look at Gates, look at these people. They dropped out of college and now they're worth billions of dollars. So that's actually a belief now that's being actively promoted, and yet, as you say, that's very heavily influenced by that survivorship bias.
Absolutely, and in fact, I think Peter Thiel had at one time set up a fund that would pay graduating high school seniors, $100,000 not to go to college and to start their own company. But it's hard to know if we could observe the whole universe of people that started companies. We might have a different view of the success. And as this applies to entrepreneurs, and we're looking out today. Let's suppose you're an entrepreneur today and some sort of innovator. Maybe you're within a company, and you think, what's working? What's worked in the past? Well, Bill Gates has worked, Facebook has worked, Amazon, Jeff Bezos. But I'm not sure that really tells us a lot about. If we're aware of the survivorship bias, again, we might say, okay, who are the people that have failed? I haven't been reading about them.
Yeah, so it comes back to what you were saying earlier. The people that are right in their predictions get publicity, the others don't. And also, the other thing that I always find fascinating is you hear about these after the fact. So you hear about the prediction when it is right, because people say, okay, I predicted this, and look back in history, this is exactly what happened. So I was right. So that's when you hear about it, not beforehand. And I always say, to my wife when, particularly if it's a stock thing or something, they say, well, I predicted that Zoom was going to go up 5,000% at the beginning of this pandemic. And I say, well, where was that prediction at the beginning of the pandemic when I could have bought some Zoom shares? It's no point in buying Zoom shares now.
They look a little rich in valuation. I would agree with that. I think there's, all clever quotes tend to be attributed to either Yogi Berra or Winston Churchill or Mark Twain, I think. But probably one of them said something like, prediction is difficult, especially about the future.
Yeah.
Predicting the past is a little bit easier. And the other thing is, if I do make a kind of a prediction and it falls flat, then I just don't go around advertising that. Somehow it doesn't make it way into my advertising brochures on my website or whatever. So this is a huge problem, is we try to decipher what kind of information we're getting from the world, whether it's about what makes for a successful entrepreneur or what makes for a good investment strategy or whatever. It always behooves us to kind of ask, what are we not seeing? Who are the people we're not seeing and the failures we're not seeing? And it's sometimes hard or even impossible to get that data, but we should be maybe a little less enthusiastic about, following these success stories that we see.
So you talk about quite a number of different biases in the book, The Foolish Corner. How can we, and I, you said bias was kind of a bit of a negative word in some ways. To me, it's like, what are we focusing our attention on? Because there are thousands of bits of information that we're bombarded with every day, and the brain, as you said before, it's a evolution thing. So to keep us surviving as a species, the brain's developed this fantastic ability to focus on things that it considers important to our own well-being and survival. And that means we're shutting out 99.9% of the information that we're being bombarded with. How do we become perhaps more aware of some of that information that might be important to us, but we're ignoring because of these biases?
No, that's a really good question. And you're right that our brain puts up a lot of filters because we're just inundated with information. But when you said what we're focusing on, the key is to make, I think, to good decision making is to be consciously focused on things, whereas these biases tend to be a little more subliminal, a little more subconscious. And so the answer is, the first step is to be aware that they exist, that we're not getting an objective view of the world. I'm certainly not going to talk about the specifics of politics, but, if wherever we find ourselves on the political spectrum, one way to think about getting a different view, or maybe even a more balanced view, is to maybe look at a news source that makes you feel uncomfortable, that does not jive with your worldview or your view of the political arena. So, one general thing is to kind of step outside your beliefs and maybe get a little bit uncomfortable. There is a thing called confirmation bias, which you've basically described, and that is confirmation bias says that we are wired to be particularly attuned to news or information that is comforting to us, that supports our worldview, that supports the views we have about political institutions or financial markets or whatever. And that is a very human, and that, by the way, is one of the most well-established biases that clearly exists. And so the example I was giving is in the political arena, and that is, maybe look at the other end of the spectrum and see, maybe you don't want to go to the way extremes of either side, but look at somebody who's telling you something that you don't quite believe and ask why they believe that and whether you should give that some weight in your overall thinking. So I think, first of all, the first step always is to be aware that we are subject to these biases. And then the question you ask is, what sort of mechanisms might we bring to play to kind of counter them so that we get better decisions, basically, whether it's about marketing, consulting, financial decisions, or whatever.
Yeah, well, the politics one is a really good example. And I think back to, I remember when I was very young, and I was born in Germany, but I grew up in Australia. And when I finished university, I moved back to Germany. And I remember following some political debate there in the late 1970s. And it struck me that the two major political parties, so the more social Democrat Party, which is kind of more towards the left, and the Christian Conservative Party, which is more to the right, they actually worked together and got this piece of legislation through. And they worked together in a way that, there was no kind of, we're going to block this because we don't like this, or there was a slanging match backwards and forwards. They actually had conversations. They had debates around, what was good and what could be improved and what should be different, and came up with a plan and implemented it. And I thought to myself, that's how democracy should work. And I'd always kind of lived through, one party would put up a proposal, regardless of which side of politics they were from, and the other party would block it simply on principle, not because it was a bad piece of legislation. It may well have been bad, it may well have been really good, but they blocked it because they were the opposition. And this is kind of our Western democracy at the moment, I think, and it's gotten more and more extreme from the point of view that the one side of politics is moving further right, one side of politics is moving further left, and then the positions have become just more and more entrenched. And I sometimes think, why can't we just have a sensible conversation and without bringing emotion or abuse into it? Why can't we have respect for one another in that? And I think that that's playing out in a lot of areas of life.
Absolutely. I mean, the polarization in the political arena that you described has, in my opinion, gotten more extreme. And there is some notion from evolutionary psychology that early humans, lived in fairly small groups, and within the group, cooperation was important to survival.
Mm.
I mean, there had to be some some people out hunting, some people doing other things, and yet other groups, people that were not in your group, were a threat to your group. So there is this kind of hardwired tendency to think about not to think consciously, but maybe to feel that there's this is my group, and that's another group. And then, so part of what happens, it seems like people on either side of the political spectrum are more strongly identifying with, this is my group, this is where I am, and the others are the enemies. And so I don't want to hear anything from them that might make sense. I mean, they're just the enemies. They can't be right, or I don't want to subject myself to thinking hard about those proposals. And it's not easy to come up with a solution for that. Your description of Germany in the late 1970s, is heartening, in that it shows that people can come in with some notion that there's a common good, which is something that's very hard to define, but some notion of the purpose of being a legislator or administrator of one type or another, and that goes beyond some narrow group interest or even narrow self-interest. So the good news in that story is that humans are capable of that. The bad news today is that we're kind of not there. At least that's speaking in my view of the United States, anyway. So
it certainly seems to be moving further and further away from what I saw as something really good at that time.
Yes, right. And it's an interesting. I don't have an answer, but it'd be an interesting question to ask. Why is that? And and again, I don't want to step on political toes here, because I think immigration is generally good for countries. But if with immigrants, you get other parties who then could become the outsiders. And back to my narrative about this is my inner group, that's my outer group. I think that's a reasonable conjecture, and I'm not just picking on Germany, by the way. That's everywhere. That there's, we certainly see that in France, we certainly see that in the United States. So, and that's just a conjecture on my part of what might have changed in Germany, and not an informed opinion, I want to be clear. But, that's kind of interesting, because what process led to that? And then if we can figure that out, maybe we can undo it a bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take it into the marketing arena a little bit more, and talk about what biases might kind of lead to bad decisions, and how we can perhaps stepwise consider some of the common biases so that we make better decisions looking forward? Like, for example, if here's a marketing trend where everybody's working from home right now because of the global pandemic. So what does that mean? There's a whole lot of things that potentially could be impacted by that. So office space, what happens to office space? There's what happens to all the people building new offices right now? Because as we come out of this pandemic, maybe businesses will say, well, actually, the work from home model isn't too bad. Maybe we don't need all the office space we have. Maybe we can do with less office space. So that's one example. I mean, there's other things. There's a whole lot of other things, I think, from the work from home trend that's happening now, and I suspect will probably stay with us in some form. How can we, as marketers or as business people, start to go through the process of, well, what are some of the biases that I might have when I look at that scenario that may cause me, or that could help me? How can I go through a process that could help me make a better decision?
Boy, that's a great question. So there's several that come to mind. One might well be something called framing, and framing has to do with essentially the way information is presented to people. A very simple example is if you ask people, "Here's a medical procedure, and if you apply it to the right people, you give it to the right patients, 95% of them will survive." And then you ask a different set of people, hopefully who are reasonably similar to the first set, and say, here's a medical procedure, and if we apply it to the appropriate patients, 5% of them will die. So this is a way, see, we presented the same information, right? But overwhelmingly, people will say, if you tell them 95% will survive, they will say, let's move ahead. And on the other hand, if you say 5% will die, people are much more reluctant to essentially approve of that medical procedure. So the way we frame things, and framing, by the way, this is sometimes the way we frame to ourselves, or maybe the way as marketers we might choose to frame to other people. So if I think about the work at home, I can frame it as, well, the company is going to save a great deal of money. I believe it was Pinterest, but I'm not sure, just paid $63 million US to get out of a lease in a building.
Mm.
And so, I mean, that tells you something about the magnitude of savings they're expecting and the percentage of their workers they're expecting to work more or less permanently from home. So, one way to frame that information, if you think that's if you're trying to make this pitch, so to speak, is to say, look at this amazing amount of savings that, I mean, prices in the major cities of the world, doesn't matter, London, Hong Kong, San Francisco, New York. I mean, the rents until recently have been just astronomical. And so you can actually make a pretty good put pencil to paper kind of case on that, and you can frame it positively and that. If you're trying to make an argument the other way, then you can frame it as, well, we're losing cohesion as a group. We can Zoom as much as we want, but that's not the same thing as being in the same room with a person, being able to read all of their body language, being able to hear even better their tone of voice. If there are several people on Zoom, they can interrupt each other, and it takes a while to figure out that someone interrupted. And so it kind of, the framing of information is basically, depends on the outcome you're trying to get, but do you want to frame it as a positive or as a negative? So I think framing is one bias that we as marketers could use in terms of trying to get, if you're marketing desks, for example. I understand, at least in the United States, there's a big shortage of desks because every kid who's studying at home now needs to have his or her own desk, right? And I mean, there's all kinds of things. Even headphones are in short supply right now, and microphones. And so anyway, the point being is, you frame this as, you think it's negative, but here's a solution. We're going to get these products in soon. I can solve your problem. Kind of a positive framing. So I think the way we frame information, and by the way, part of confirmation bias in a sense is that we consciously or unconsciously frame information to ourselves as we think about the world. What do I think about the job I'm doing today? Am I doing a good job, let's say, as a professor in the classroom? And, and I've got 32 happy students and 3 unhappy students. Well, do I frame that as looking at the 32, or these could be clients, for the consultants and coaches that are listening, and do I focus on the 32 happy ones, or do I focus on the 3 unhappy ones? And so I think that has a lot to do too with just the narratives we tell ourselves. So I think framing is a very important part, and I think instinctually, I think a lot of marketing people know about that. Maybe they don't have the label, but I think it's something a lot of marketing people practice.
Yeah, I like your example about the students, and you suggested that could be applied to customers. Do I have 35 happy customers and 3 unhappy customers, and what does that mean? To me the benefit of the framing, and I wonder, I think you'd kind of talked about this indirectly in the book with some other biases, but looking at it from both sides of that, to actually force yourself then to take the opposite view. If you look at, I've got 32 out of 35 happy customers, that's a fantastic result. If you multiply that up, I mean, what does that work out to? That works out to
90, I didn't pick the right numbers.
95%. Let's say it's about 95%, which is, hey, that's a fabulous score. So you can take that approach and say, we're doing a great job. We don't need to change anything. Everything's working beautifully, right? But if and that's a good thing to do, because the opposite side of that is to look at, okay, there's three unhappy ones, and let's say that's a 5% unhappy rate. Well, we actually don't want anybody unhappy. So we're going to beat ourselves up where, our systems are broken. What went wrong? Why are they unhappy? All of these things need to be changed and fixed, which is kind of losing sight of the fact that there's actually 32 happy customers who are happy with everything that's going on. And there's a risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, to use that metaphor, if you focus on the other side and say we have to change everything. And yet at the same time, if you just focus on the happy ones, then there's a risk, of course, that you're missing out on some key learnings, because the feedback from those unhappy customers will highlight some issues that are there. They must be there, otherwise they wouldn't be unhappy. And so how do you suggest we kind of go into that? Because on the one hand, it's great to celebrate the wins. I think as entrepreneurs, we probably don't do enough of that. But on the other hand, we don't want to ignore what, the signs of things that could go badly wrong later on down the track, and perhaps early warning signs of something that if we take the feedback on board, we can fix.
Well, my answer also goes back not only to this question, but a question you posed earlier, and that what sort of methods do we have to kind of essentially keep a balanced view of things, as realistic a view of the world and the job we're doing in the world. And another thing that I talk about briefly in the book is called the devil's advocate. And but among your listeners, I know you have coaches and consultants, and I think that's a role that they can very easily play if they find if they have a client, or this can apply to any sort of mentoring relationship whatsoever. Is especially if you find, let's say, a client particularly entrenched in a view, like, I'm doing a great job teaching, I've got 32 happy customers. The devil's advocate is simply to say, well, is there an alternative view? Let me give you an alternative view of that. And that is that, well, perfection, all 35, is probably not possible. Maybe the 3 could be less unhappy, and so forth. So, maybe you're focusing a little bit too much on the positive. Or, of course, some people do focus a lot on the negative. They may just think, oh my gosh, I've got 3 really unhappy people when, sorry about the sports analogy, but the batting average is pretty good here. And, and so forth. So I do think any sort of mentoring relationship, one of the things the mentor can do, again, as a life coach, as a consultant or whatever, is, and this person doesn't have to believe the contrary view, but just say, what if your view is wrong? What if you could do better than 32? At least, let's say, reducing the unhappiness of the 3. Or, what if your worldview is wrong about some marketing plans you put in place? And, can you give that some thought for a while? and then there's another mechanism that I'm very fond of in terms, and now this has more at the planning stages. So we think about maybe entrepreneurs or people who are trying to maybe think about a new product, something of that sort, trying to be innovative in some general way. And that is something called the pre-mortem. And I think we all know, you can kind of guess, right? You all know what a post-mortem is, like the patient's dead, what went wrong. Now, pre-mortem is kind of a thought experiment where maybe we're thinking about launching a product or a marketing campaign or whatever it might be. Maybe we want to start being a podcaster or whatever. But before we do it, we sit down and say, well, what could go wrong with this? And I say this in particular, responding to your notion that sometimes we ignore information, that things are not as bright, the future is not as bright as we think. We kind of miss those early warning signs, I think was the phrase you used. And I think, especially sitting there with a devil's advocate and thinking, okay, what are the things that could go wrong with this project? And then there's a process after which you say, which of those things might be under our control and which are not? What's it cost to mitigate that risk that we can control? And then, do we move ahead or not? I mean, every new project has some amount of risk. There's no denying that. You're not going to reduce it to zero. But I really like the idea of a pre-mortem. I ran this idea by a friend of mine who used to work for a hedge fund, and he said, if you mentioned that idea in a meeting, you would be literally kicked out of the room. Like those people just don't like to think about, what could go wrong. They're so focused, But nonetheless, I think that's a pretty valuable tool that we could use for, again, launching almost any kind of endeavor.
Yeah, I remember when I first was learning project management and they came up with this idea. They had a different name for it. I can't remember what the name was, but it was essentially what you're describing. So it was, well, what can possibly go wrong with this plan? And that was part of the project planning up front before you even started on it. And then what they did was kind of, there was a brainstorming step to, okay, what are all the things we need to do? How can we make this successful? And then there was a brainstorming around, well, what can go wrong? Really free brainstorming. Wild ideas came up there as well. And then you actually ranked those things in terms of, what's the likelihood of that happening? What's the impact? So is it a high or low impact? And also, like you said, if it were to happen, can we influence or can we prevent it happening? Do we have any influence on that? And I thought, wow, that is really powerful because it kind of puts you in a position to have that risk mitigation in place and also in a way that you focus energy on the things that if, they're perhaps more highly likely to happen and have a high impact, and you can have some impact, you can have some influence over either how you deal with it or even the event itself. So I thought that was really powerful.
I like you've kind of constructed a 2x2 matrix. I'm going to simplify your narrative a little bit.
Yeah.
We kind of have controllable things and non-controllable things, and then high impact and low impact. We're going to have a 2x2 matrix, and things that are not under our control, a meteorite hitting our factory or something. First of all, it's very low probability, so we could make this three-dimensional, but it's nothing presumably we control, so maybe we just don't worry about that. And then the other feature which you kind of hinted at was that if one of these pops up, we've already thought about it. We're not. We may even have a plan B, like, if we do this, we're going to do that. If this comes up, we're going to do that. And so there are fewer surprises, less stress. We know decision making is not as good under stress and so forth. So, and I think McKinsey, what I call a devil's advocate, they talk about having a person called a project killer. But the duty is kind of the same, like, you shouldn't do this project because this could go wrong and this could go wrong and this could go wrong. Whether one's heart is in that or not is not the point. It's just simply to try to identify all those things that might go wrong. And one of the problems, and I will confess, being a professor, I'm far too risk averse to be a professor. And you give me a project and I'll tell you 25 things that'll go wrong with it. And I think entrepreneurs and innovators of all types tend to not dwell too much on that. They tend to be optimists by nature. They tend to be confident by nature. And so I don't think I'm an entrepreneur. I'm willing to invest in entrepreneurs, but that way I can kind of spread my risk a little bit. So there is a balance too, because one is, going back to the student example, one can become overly fixated, as I might, on the risk and not go ahead with a project that ultimately makes sense. Not ex post makes sense, meaning even before the fact makes sense. So they were doing enlightened project management some time ago, before behavioral economics got into the headlines, so to speak.
Yeah. Although, I still don't see it being used that actively. So,
well, that's too bad, because I think that's a very powerful tool. I really do. So,
all right. Well, this has been fabulous so far, John. I really appreciate it, and I think it's a good point to move on to the buzz, which is our innovation round.
Okay.
Because otherwise, we can talk all day about human behavior and how it applies to different aspects of life. We've covered economics, we've covered politics, and we've moved on to a bit of marketing and project management. So let's talk innovation from the point of view of these 5 questions in the buzz round, which is designed to help our audience, who are primarily innovators and leaders in their field. And I hope that we'll get some answers that'll inspire the audience to go and do something awesome today as a result.
Okay. I don't have them on the screen in front of me, so if you could run them by me, I'd appreciate it.
So
I've studied them.
What's the number one thing anyone needs to do to be more innovative?
Well, can I give you 2 things? And then if you insist, I'll rank them. But
Sure.
I know one of your prior guests was a big fan of improvisation. And what I would call the improv mentality is one where you try to be a little more free thinking, where you don't take no for an answer. You're permitted kind of wild ideas, not just of the negative type, like a meteor is going to hit our factory kind of thing, but and so forth. So I will call that, your audience might want to look up that podcast, because I'm sure that was a fascinating one. The second thing it sounds a little weird, but I think you need to set aside time to be bored. Now, that sounds a little strange, but, the stereotype, which is not entirely wrong, of childhood at least in the United States in the 60s, was you got home from school, didn't have homework. They weren't doing homework in the lower grades at that time. And your parents, probably your mom, sticking to sort of a stereotypical thing, but say, go outside and play, get away, I'll ring a bell for dinner, get out of here, right? And you'd go out in the back and you say, well, there's nothing to do here. And, like initially you're kind of bored. Then a stick becomes a sword, or whatever the story is, right?
Yeah.
But I think sometimes you kind of have, it's kind of like a fallow field in a way. And so many of us are just, running around all the time, thinking that we have to do everything at every moment, that there's just, and our downtime is not really reflective time or even bored time. So anyway, it's kind of a funny answer, but I think you need, give yourself a little bit of time, just like, I'm just going to be bored, and then see where your mind takes you from there.
Yeah, that's a fascinating reframe, actually, of an answer that I think a lot of my guests have given, in terms of taking time away or outside of the normal to allow your mind to actually come up with some creative stuff. And you've reminded me, our kids often would say to us, I'm bored, and I would kind of say, well, I'm Jürgen, I'm pleased to meet you. Because I always thought, well, what's wrong with being bored? I mean, if you're always bored, that would be perhaps a problem. But if you're occasionally bored, well, then find a way to be not bored.
Exactly.
That's sort of the innovation part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Love it. And Peter Margaritis was the episode for the improv. He was the person that we spoke about improv for the whole episode long. So go check that one out. Now, what's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas?
Well, I've tried to first of all, practice what I preach. So I do try to set a time, downtime, board time, whatever. I also I just really love reading, and I try to read way out of my field if at all possible. I mean, psychology is not out of the field of behavioral economics, but to read, um, theories um, of civilizations rising and falling, and just whatever kind of grabs my attention. And it certainly doesn't work all the time, but sometimes you can piece together things that seem unrelated. And I'm not talking about. I mean, there's sometimes works. A small innovation in one industry can be brought over to another, but I think sometimes there are ideas that are even further apart. That sometimes you can connect the dots, so to speak, and come up with a kind of creative idea. So I think in my case, when I'm not trying to bore myself, I'm reading basically.
Yeah, yeah, and there's so much great literature around, including the Foolish Corner. Uh, and I think you said something really interesting there in terms of taking lessons out of that, recognizing patterns or connecting the dots from something that might be, let's say, a historical report talking about the rise and fall of a civilization, for example. There's lots of behavioral patterns in there that you could probably draw out and say, well, how could that apply to what I'm doing?
Yeah, what caused what are the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, for example? And
Mm.
I'm not an expert on that question, but historians have weighed in on that, and there could be a lesson in that for the decline of a company, for example.
Mm.
That does not strike me as at all far-fetched.
Yeah. All right. Now, do you have a favorite resource you use most often? You mentioned reading books.
Yeah, I've not a favorite resource. That's tough. Um, my 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 kind of daily news is the BBC. I like the BBC because it's not American, but it's still kind of Western, And, but, pre-pandemic, I would have said my favorite resource is my colleagues.
Mm.
And, this goes back to one of the problems with working with home. Because when you're in the building, at least in the building in my situation, you run into people in the hall and you start these conversations, and sometimes it's just, what are you doing? What's up? How are your kids? Whatever. And sometimes you go, I saw this article on the BBC website that says this is going on, and they go, oh, I haven't been thinking. And suddenly you're talking about maybe a research project and so forth. So
Mm.
I'm hoping the day will come when my favorite resource is again my colleagues, but I'm not going to campus very much at all, and teaching online, and most of my colleagues are as well. And so there's just not that interaction, which is one of the downsides of working from home.
Mm. That's an interesting challenge, that one. And I'm sure there's ways to kind of make some changes to address that. But yeah, certainly people, interaction with people and having those meaningful conversations that you talked about there, that perhaps come about because just simply what's on your mind right now that leads into that meaningful conversation. That's a really valuable resource. All right, now what's the best way to keep a client on track?
Well, this is certainly not new with me. In fact, is said quite a bit, but most of us, if we contemplate a very large task, can feel overwhelmed by it. So again, we've all heard this advice. So I hate to give it, but when you break things into these a little more bite-sized chunks, so to speak, you figure out what the goal is. The goal is maybe to roll out some ad campaign or to start manufacturing a new product. There's the end. And if you think, oh my gosh, I got to build a factory, I got to hire people, I got to make sure that the machines are safe, I got to make sure that you just, and so I just think breaking things down into doable steps with accountable deadlines, of course, is the way to keep them on track. And if that's a client, if you're a consultant or a life coach or a coach, business coach, they know they're going to get that call Friday at noon and say, what have we done since last Friday? And you better have an answer for that
Yeah.
that you've actually done something. But you can't build a factory in a week. So what small steps did maybe you two agree on towards, I'm going to hire a land consultant, for example, or a location specialist, and so forth. I had a friend whose entire career was finding locations for new McDonald's restaurants. And I didn't know that was a career, but it is. And such people are out there,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that reminds me, and one of my favorite metaphors around this breaking things down is my piano or my kids' piano teachers when they were really young. They were very talented pianists, and they would play these oh, half-hour long, 45-minute long piano concertos, that from memory. And I was always fascinated how, this was like an 8 or a 10-year-old child memorizing this, playing it, not just playing the notes, but the whole expression, everything, the coordination with the orchestra. And I I would always say to the piano teacher, I'd say, this is amazing that you can bring this gift out of the kids, and I just cannot imagine how they do that. 45-minute long piece of music and all the stuff that's involved and committing that to memory. And she said, it's like eating pizza, one piece at a time.
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
No, I can remember my son, was right hand, first two measures.
Yeah.
That's the way it started,
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great analogy. I like that.
Yeah. All right. Now, what's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
That's a good question. I think one has to think about the messaging. I think has to think about one's target audience. Again, nothing new to your listeners, but like A/B testing, for example, and let B be kind of crazy. Let's say we're doing some sort of email campaign, just for example, I think you need to be creative with at least some of your outreach, but then test it. Don't assume just because it's unusual or even bizarre that somehow it's going to catch on. So do a little A/B testing where you do something maybe a little more conventional, but then maybe something a little hire kind of a real artistic kind of person or something, and that may be the successful, say, marketing campaign. So,
Yeah, I love it. Do the A/B testing with something a bit way out.
yeah,
What
right.
what you think is way out, it's still your
Right,
buy.
right. That's true. That's why you need at least one other person in on it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, fabulous. Thanks, John. This has been really great. Now, where can people find out more about you and maybe even reach out to say thanks for what you've shared and certainly to get a hold of the book, The Foolish Corner?
Well, I'm at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, as you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast. If you just Google the University of Missouri, I'm in the Department of Finance, and my email is readily available. It's Howe J, which is my last name and my first initial, at missouri.edu, and anybody is welcome to get in touch with me that way. My book is available on Amazon in two forms. It's print on demand, usually shows up in a day or two, which I've never quite figured out the logistics of that, but it's impressive. And it's also available in the ebook format. So that's how to get a hold of me, and that's how to get a hold of my book.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll have links to those in the show notes, of course. Now, what's parting advice would you like to leave our listener today, John?
That's a really good question, and I got to admit I'm kind of caught up in this. One thing I'd like to recommend to your readers and perhaps to you as a potential future guest is a guy named Hans Rosling, and it's Rosling. And he wrote a book called Factfulness. It's one word. It's kind of a made-up word. But basically, this guy, I'm just so impressed with his book, and I think I can see very meaningful applications for the people that are listening to this. He's basically saying if you really look at statistics, and he's a great statistics collector, many of the conceptions about the world that we have are wrong. And it's, for example, we have the notion that maybe the world's getting more violent. And in fact, any kind of objective data shows it's not getting more violent. And then he goes and says, why might we believe this? It's because of the media, the splashy things, kind of like splashy predictions, get the headlines, and, a headline that says, oh, violence was worse last year than this year is rare. We see those occasionally, but and so forth. But I think in some sense, it goes back to the overall theme of this entire discussion. And that is, if we want to see things clearly, one of the bases for that is to be aware of our biases and about how to counter them. But one of them is to have good data. And if we have a wrong view of the world, then we're likely not to be making good decisions. And so again, the book is called Factfulness. I've never met the guy. I'm not on commission, nothing of that sort. It's a book that very much impressed me because, I think in some cases I believe some of these things which the data can show are demonstrably wrong. And I believe I'm open-minded enough to change my view with this new evidence. But I think it applies to marketing, consulting, any field whatsoever. Have the right data, read the book and be impressed. You may become more of a data nerd than you were in the past.
Yeah. And thanks for that advice. And you've reminded me, I've listened to a couple of Hans Rosling's TED Talks where he explains data. And in fact, he's one of my models as a presenter. So I never actually had him on my radar as a potential podcast guest. So I'm going to have to go out and stalk him and get him on the podcast.
I think that'd be fun. I would love to hear him. I've seen the TED Talks, and again, he's written a very, very coherent book.
Yeah. I'll check out that book. Thanks for that. All right. Now, I was going to ask the final question, which is who else should I get on the podcast? But you've already given us that.
I was afraid you were going to drop that one. That's why I did that. But I don't know. In terms of overall advice, it's easy to say be open-minded or seek out additional information or seek out alternative views. It's difficult to do because seeking out an alternative view and maybe admitting that we might be wrong is uncomfortable. And generally, we like being comfortable. But I think you're going to make more progress if you're uncomfortable at least some of the time. So maybe that's an odd piece of advice, but that's what I got.
All right. Well, thanks, John. Thanks so much for sharing your time and your insights with us today. I've really enjoyed this. I'm pretty sure that the listener will get a lot out of this, even though we sort of came at it from economics first, then politics. But I think we eventually ended up in business and marketing and general mindset things around business and marketing. So thanks for kind of taking us on that journey today, and I wish you all the best for the future, and let's stay in touch.
Thanks so much. I very much enjoyed it myself.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed that insightful and thought-provoking conversation with John and took something away from his episode. The idea that our biases have us notice certain things and ignore others is certainly something to be aware of and curious about. And it applies not just to economics, but to all our decision-making. I'd love to know what you took away from John's episode. Leave a comment below the blog post, which you can find at innovabiz.co/John Howe. That is JOHNHOWE. All lowercase, all one word, innovabiz.co/John Howe. You'll also find contact information for getting in touch with John there, as well as links to his page on the University of Missouri website, his LinkedIn page, his book, The Foolish Corner, as well as a subscription link to his newsletter and the other resources we spoke about in today's conversation. John referred to the book Factfulness by Swedish physics and statistics professor Hans Rosling. He suggested we have a conversation with him on a future InnovaBuzz podcast. However, it turns out that, unfortunately, Professor Rosling passed away in February of 2017, which is something that I hadn't caught up with and John hadn't apparently either. Now, we're good to get people on the show, but not that good. What we'll do is we'll link to Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, in the show notes so that you can read about his wonderful work and also link to a couple of his TED Talks so that you can get the benefit of the wisdom of Professor Rosling, which John referred to. Tune in again to the next episodes of the InnovaBuzz podcast. We've got even more fantastic guests lined up, including Jamie J. of Bottleneck Virtual Assistants and Jonathan Green of Serve No Master. Thanks for listening to this episode. Make sure you subscribe to the show to be reminded of new episodes. It's free to subscribe. Leave a review if you like. Even if you don't like me, I'm okay with that. I'm asking you to leave a review because it helps other people find this show. Go to InnovaBuzz.co to join our marketing transformation community and access a free gift my team and I made for you. It's the Marketing Master Mini Class. We want to give you everything you need to transform your marketing into a human-centered, relationship-focused growth engine. Until next time, I'm Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz. Remember, be awesome and keep innovating.